because we are launching a new initiative. I'm very sorry that I can't be there in person. Unfortunately, I am just in the process of recovering from COVID, but I'm so very grateful that we have the ability to host hybrid events like this. And I wanted to give a very special thank you to our communications and outreach specialist, Genevieve Dunn, and our research and communications administrative assistant, Yasmina El Harim, for organizing all of this. It is a tremendous amount of effort to pull together a successful hybrid event, and Jen and Yasmina, we couldn't do it without you, so thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. L'événement aura lieu en anglais, mais si jamais vous avez des questions ou des commentaires en français, soyez les bienvenus. We'll begin the event today with an Indigenous affirmation. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region, from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders past, present, and future. So welcome again. For those who don't know me, my name is Monica Gattinger. It's my absolute honor to be director of the Institute for Science, Society and Policy. We are a cross-faculty institute at the University of Ottawa. So we bring together professors and senior practitioners from across the science, society, and policy space. The ISSP has a very ambitious strategic vision for the forthcoming number of years, which is to help Canada transform decision-making to meet the grand challenges of our time. So we know that whether those grand challenges are climate change or global health, pandemics, any of the tremendously complex and intractable problems that we're facing globally, that we really do need to bring together, do a better job of bridging and aligning science, society, and policy imperatives. It's such a pleasure to work at the Institute, where so many of our members really just by their very nature, that is exactly the kind of work that they're keen to do. And we're very fortunate that they choose to engage with us to do that. So I'm extremely excited about this food for thought to start off our year. It is the public launch of a new initiative called Confluences that you're going to hear more about in a moment from Jeff Kinder, our executive in residence. Confluences really embodies what we're trying to do with our new strategic vision, which is provide an opportunity, a platform, and just novel cutting edge ways to bring people from the science, society, policy interface together with new knowledge mobilization processes, and trying to bring them together in a way that will maximize impact, not only for research, but also for practice when it comes to transforming decision-making for grand challenges. I'd like to thank the Office of the Vice President, Research and Innovation at the University of Ottawa for providing Confluences with some funding for this inaugural year of the initiative. It has enabled us to defray some of the costs of this event, and perhaps most importantly, has supported the Institute to hire an inaugural graduate fellow. This is a new role at the Institute that we've just created this year, that it offers an opportunity for a doctoral candidate who's interested in science policy at the University of Ottawa to broaden their understanding and networks of science policy within and beyond Canada. So I'd like to thank you for joining us today. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Jeff Kinder, who is our inaugural executive in residence at the Institute, somebody who has put a lot of energy and time and initiative behind this initiative, Confluences. He is very much the driving force. So Jeff, over to you. We're really looking forward to learning more about Confluences and getting into our session for today.
Okay, thank you very much, Monica. I'm going to just move up to the front. So welcome everyone. For those online, we've got about 10 or so folks here in the room, and welcome all of you. It is the inaugural food for thought of this academic year for ISSP. I also want to thank Monica very much for her leadership in driving this initiative. I mean, she gave me too much credit. This has really been a joint effort, and I really appreciate the partnership that we've developed. I also want to acknowledge my other home. 4 days a week, I'm with the Council of Canadian Academies, and I really appreciate that both organizations have found this very synergistic partnership or collaboration that I benefit from. So we've got an amazing lineup today of speakers, and I want to get to them as we can, but I do want to spend just a few minutes giving you kind of the high-level overview of what we're doing here with this new initiative. Not sure if we pronounce it Confluences or Confluences. Anyway, but it works both in English and French, so that's a positive. But let me just run through a few slides and give you kind of the high-level overview, and then I'll introduce our first speaker today. So as everyone on this call in this room knows, the challenges that we're facing are huge. Well, so the grand challenges that we're facing, they require a new approach, interdisciplinary approach, a cross-sectoral approach. And what we're trying to do with this initiative is really try to mobilize knowledge to address those challenges. The Institute, as Monica said, cross-faculty institute, it draws on an amazing network of researchers. We think they're doing really incredible work, but nonetheless, there's still an untapped opportunity to co-produce and mobilize that knowledge with decision makers across a wide range of sectors, whether that be federal government, NGOs, or civil society. So in this initiative, we're taking what's called a pracademic approach. This is a word I learned a few years ago. It's perhaps a too clever combination of the words practitioners and academics, but it does kind of capture the idea of what we're trying to do here, where we're combining direct engagement between practitioners in, like I say, various sectors and academics to help mobilize that knowledge and to co-create various activities that will help mobilize knowledge, including kind of the anchor product initiative, which is an edited volume. Speak to that a little bit. So the idea is that we want to develop a product that brings together key developments over the year in science, society, and policy research. We would include a statistical update, having a look at the federal budget to see what it has to offer in this space. And then the core will be chapters by invited speakers, invited authors, focusing on various themes, and I'll show those in a minute. But choosing issues that would be of relevance to decision makers. So the idea is try to shift a little bit away from kind of a traditional academic tone to have chapters that are perhaps a bit shorter, perhaps a bit lighter on theory and methodology, and perhaps a bit stronger on policy implications and societal impacts. We are in early discussions with the University of Ottawa Press, but our hope is that this will be an e-book of some kind, an open access format, so that there's no barriers there in terms of access. As I mentioned, we've already did a wide range of really impressive authors who are contributors who will be addressing a wide range of topics. These are just some of the topics that we will have in the first year's volume. As you can see, it spans wide range of the space of the science, society, policy space, innovation space. And so I'm really excited to see what the authors are able to produce. We've also gotten very strong support from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. So one of the chapters will be interview with the president at Hewitt. We've also got interest from the Canada Foundation for Innovation, so they will have a chapter as well. And then many of you who are here today or online will be contributing authors. So my thanks to. But again, it's not just about a book. This is very much a broader knowledge mobilization initiative. So we see the book as kind of the anchor product, but then as a platform to have discussions and briefings with decision makers, obviously, producing plain language policy briefs. We've already held a couple workshops, and we imagine holding more of those that, again, bring these three communities together. We're considering what we can do in terms of podcasts or video recordings. To some extent, this will depend on resourcing, but at this point, we're ambitious about where we can go with this. Once the book is complete, we'll have a book launch sometime next year. And then through the wonderful work of Jen and Yasmina, we'll be doing blogs, op-eds, and social media posts, all in the spirit of connecting this knowledge to decision makers and facilitators. We are very fortunate to have an incredibly impressive group advising us. 14 people have stepped up, again from Ottawa, but also federal departments and agencies and other organizations in the civil society space. Huge shout out to these 14 individuals who have been providing some very helpful advice on develop this initiative. And internally, Monica's already mentioned the team. I just want to as well welcome Bogie, our new graduate fellow, who I guess just began last week, or maybe even this week. I guess it was Monday. Yeah, it was Thursday. So yeah, it was just this Monday. So welcome, Bryce, and look forward to working very closely with you on this initiative. So let me just close then by saying, where are we going with this? Again, I think there could be lots of positive impacts of this type of initiative, and I'm eager to hear what our three speakers think in terms of that. We're looking for co-created learnings, knowledge dissemination, uptake, and impact. We want to provide some tools or toolkits and accessible resources, facilitates all this, and then clearly, as with this event and other similar events and workshops, we facilitate blogging in society. So with that, let me shift back and introduce our first speaker. So we've got three amazing speakers. I will not do justice to their broad range of experience in each case, but I will just give you a hint of who they are. So Dr. Peggy Schmeiser will be our first speaker. She is recently the Director of Public Policy Research and Outreach here at the Office of the Vice President of Research and Innovation at University of Ottawa. She's actually the inaugural holder of that position. Previously, she was a member of the faculty for many years at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan, where she co-founded the Center for the Study of Science and Innovation Policy. And her research is across a range of topics, including public policy, governance, ethics, evidence and decision-making, science and innovation, and the intersections and conflicts among concepts like freedom of religion, human rights, and equality. So Peggy, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jeff. Et, bonjour tout le monde. Je suis très, très heureuse d'être ici. Ici ou avec vous dans une façon virtuelle pour la discussion. Comme Jeff a indiqué, mon nom est Peggy Schmeiser. Je suis la directrice recherche et liaison en matière de politique publique. Donc, j'ai énormément d'intérêt dans ce sujet. So this is really, in many ways, for me, an extraordinary experience to be able to have this kind of conversation with people who are interested in areas that I'm extremely passionate about, but don't always find an opportunity to share that enthusiasm and hope for how we might work together. So this is just wonderful. I thought to begin the discussion, what I would do is just share a few reflections on, I guess, what I see as the strengths of this new opportunity of Confluences, not just the annual publication, but also the broader initiative as Jeff was describing. I thought I would just make a couple points about that and then just share some of my own personal research interests as an example of how I'm hoping some of this can apply, and we can talk across our various backgrounds. So first of all, as far as contributions, I think that this is going to present really an extraordinary and unique forum, not only for us to think about the practical applications of research and the evidence that we produce, the data that we produce, but also for many of us in the academic world as researchers, we can find it sometimes difficult to find a place or find a home for ourselves when we're interested in working across disciplines and across sectors, which of course, that interface of science, society, and policy necessitates. And for those who might not necessarily be on the academic side or the research side, other journals, other forums sometimes are more targeted, more uniquely focused around particular methodologies. And I think the beauty and the promise of this initiative is that it allows that sort of forum. It opens new and essential opportunities for us to talk, to collaborate across these divergent perspectives. And I just see that as an incredibly enriching opportunity for all of us. Secondly, I think what excites me so much about this work is that it enables us to bridge the very content and the processes that I think still continue in various ways to divide us between the public sector and the academic research world. And I say that as someone who's worked for many, many years as an academic, as a university administration, but also with the federal government for close to a decade. And sometimes there are differences, of course, in the language we use or in the expectation around the information that's required to make the decisions, the policy decisions. But I think that this kind of, again, the forum helps us bridge those divides. I think that by providing targeted, accessible information, hopefully very accessible information for policy decision makers on one hand, but also providing a peer-reviewed opportunity for the academic and research community, I think it's a win-win. Now, I would go farther and even say it's a win-win-win because in terms of what it's going to focus on, it's not just the content of the information for me. I think it's also that we're going to find ways now to talk with each other about how we do evidence-based decision-making. What does that actually mean? We use that term a lot, but how do we actually make that happen together? And what are some of those obstacles? So in that respect, I think bridging those divides is again going to be of great service to all of us and ultimately to addressing some of these large, grand challenges that Jeff and Monica were referring to. So lastly, I just wanted to share just an example from my own work, just to show, I guess, or to illustrate some of my profound enthusiasm and interest in this. For many years, I've been interested in examining issues relating to big science, and in particular, policies and funding mechanisms that go into supporting science and research in Canada. And so over the last number of years, I've led a couple of research teams that are very broad. They range from having synchrotron scientists to having social scientists to having humanists on board, where we have conducted interviews at many major science initiatives or facilities across Canada, large-scale national facilities, to try to understand better the capacity of the research community, particularly in the context of big science, to engage in, I guess, what the government has really promoted around models of convergence research, where we work across disciplines. We try to work across sectors to find some of these large-scale solutions. And in doing those interviews, it's been very, very interesting to see the responses to current policy, current funding models, Canada in the context of the broader world, and international approaches to research and evidence. And I find that our discussions around this current initiative, Confluences, provides just an incredible opportunity to think of as a form of a way for us now to share some of that work and continue that dialogue, both with folks on the side of the public sector and other sectors, as well as with the academic community. And that is, for me, that just strikes me as a very unique opportunity and a unique example about how this can hopefully play out and provide an extraordinary platform for all the various sides. So I think I'll just stop there. Again, I'm very happy to be part of this conversation. I look forward to contributing as the discussion continues to unfold. So thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. Thank you very much. So in the pre session that we had with the speakers, I think, Peggy, you used the idea of crossing the canal. So if anyone is joining us who's not from Ottawa, the image there, of course, is that the federal government is in the downtown core, and the universities in this city, University of Ottawa, Carleton, St. Paul's, are on the other side of the canal. And so there's this notion of needing to cross the canal. So I really like that metaphor. So thank you, Peggy.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Dr. Danica Gustny. She has just completed, I think, her first year of a 5-year term as president and CEO of the Canadian Museum of Nature. She's passionate about science literacy and building trust in science, as well as improving equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility in STEM. She has her PhD in microbiology and immunology, and from the University of British Columbia, where she received the Governor General's Gold Medal. Congratulations on that. And Danica has the hat trick because she has spent time at each of the 3 granting councils, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and then most recently as a vice president of research grants and scholarships at Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council. Danica.
Thank you, Jeff. Good day, everybody in the room and online. I will try not to look at the screen. It's a bit backwards, so I'll be speaking to a camera on the ceiling here. So as Jeff mentioned, I've spent the bulk of my career, almost 2 decades, within the federal tri-councils in a variety of roles in research programs, policy, and knowledge mobilization. And so when I heard about this Confluences initiative, I was all in. I was super supportive. The pracademic approach is exactly what I think we need to be promoting. In my mind, the Canadian public deserves to have the best advice, the best evidence, and the best approaches to solutions it can have. And us as public servants, or at least me and in my roles now as public servants, we need to know how to ask the right questions and get the data to back up those policies while we're doing that work. From the researcher perspective and other folks who have the data and the evidence, they need to know how to present it in a way that will be easily accessible, understood, and implemented by decision makers and users, which means understanding the context within which the public servants and other end users are working. So thank you again for allowing me to be part of this. And I will reflect a little bit based on my experience on how the issue of knowledge mobilization, informing decision making has been what I've been focused on throughout my career. And so I see it sort of from 2 different perspectives. One, in the context of designing federal programs and policies for the research community, I worked with my colleagues in the tri-councils to try to figure out how to expand on the best definition of research impact, knowledge mobilization, to allow researchers to showcase how their work can be used outside of academia. So be it an industrial application, government policy settings, hospital policy, and so on. So that's sort of the one-pronged approach. And then secondly, as a decision maker myself within the federal public service, thinking of how I can identify, access, and use reliable current data to inform the work I'm doing and in a timely fashion. And sometimes that's not evident where to go and who to trust. Interestingly, so now in this role as the CEO of the Canadian Museum of Nature, I find myself bridging both of these worlds. So in some ways, I remain the decision maker requiring the information. And in other ways, I'm running a scientific institution. The museum has over 50 active researchers at a campus over in Gatineau. And I want to make sure that the data that we're collecting is made accessible and useful for other policymakers and decision makers across the country and within the federal government. So in terms of my contribution to this, I'm very excited to be contributing a book chapter. I hope it gets accepted. So maybe I don't want to make big promises just yet, but I'd really like to work on something along with the Vice President of Research and Collections at the museum, Jeff Sorella, describing how you can leverage data to inform policy decisions in environmental conservation and biodiversity management. So there's a ton, and this sounds more like a plug for the Canadian Museum of Nature, but bear with me, it's broader than that. There are a ton of biological and geological collections that are housed in museums, universities, other institutions across the country that represent an invaluable source of scientific data that can inform evidence-based policymaking, but they remain hugely underused due to issues related to access, analysis, synthesis, and summarization. So what Jeff and I are hoping to do with this initiative is delve into the role of these collections in understanding biodiversity and geodiversity, tracking environmental changes, and addressing the pressing conservation challenges, with the end goal of highlighting the importance of these collections as a critical piece of research infrastructure for the country and repositories of knowledge that can drive informed and sustainable policy interventions. So I think I'll stop there and pass it over to Kim, or pass it back to Jeff. You could pass it to Kim.
Great. Thanks, Danica. So last up, we've got Kim. Kimberly Gerling is the Manager of Science Strategy at the Office of the Chief Science Officer at the Public Health Agency of Canada. She is also a member of the ISSP Advisory Committee. She has her PhD in neuroscience, also from UBC, and she has developed a passion for science policy. She was among the inaugural cohort, I think it was the inaugural cohort of the MITAC's Canadian Science Policy Fellowship Program. I think that's where we met originally. She has since worked for Defense R&D Canada, ISED, Innovation Science and Economic Development Canada, and for a time, she was with the Evidence for Democracy organization as its research and policy director, followed by a stint as the interim executive director. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for having me. So I feel like, following both of you, it's so nice to hear, I think, a lot of the same reflections across all of us, which is that I think that this is a really exciting and very necessary piece to contribute to the science society and policy interface. And like Danica, I jumped at the opportunity to participate because honestly, I've wanted something like this for a really long time. And if you look at my path as a practitioner of science policy, starting as a scientist, as a PhD, I didn't actually want to be a prof. I got into science because I was really passionate about how science impacts the decisions that we make, the people and the communities that we live in. I was a drug discovery scientist and I thought, cool, I'm going to go into science. I'm going to be making all these big discoveries and I'm going to be contributing to the products that we use in medicine or the decisions that we make around science. But the reality of working as a PhD level scientist is that I had very little knowledge of actually how those decisions happen. And I found it really frustrating as a scientist because I wanted to contribute meaningfully to discussions around policy, but I didn't have a platform or forum. So I could publish scientific papers, but those weren't making their way into policy decisions necessarily, or I didn't know how to find the right platforms. And honestly, to my knowledge, those platforms didn't exist. And so that's what really brought me into this space. And I feel like when I was at E4D, working as a member of this kind of society science representative organization, I felt a lot of the same challenges reflected back at me from our scientific community of scientists who are really passionate about issues that they wanted to contribute meaningfully to policy, or members of the public who wanted to have a better understanding of how decisions are made or how science is integrated into decision making. And so now, as a person who's actually been working in the government, I had the immense privilege of working for Theresa Tam during the pandemic. And I can say with, passion and real reality that I do know we have a government who cares deeply about science. And I heard this when I was working at E4D too, in my study that I did interviewing members of parliament, that decision makers really want to make evidence-informed decisions. And during the pandemic, I can say, based on my experience, we dreamed up and built a lot of really amazing tools to find and access science. these new mechanisms for evidence synthesis, new shops were built up, science capacities were really built. But the reality of doing evidence-based decision-making in policy is hard. And the pace, I think Danica or Peggy, both of you talked about the challenges of the pacing between policymaking and the way that science is happening. The languages that we speak is so different. And so while it's great that we have all these amazing tools, I think one of the challenges is contextualizing science within a government context. And so even if we had mechanisms for things like, science advice or knowledge synthesis or science communication, I think that one of the challenges is always going to be putting that policy, that science into a policy space. Mm-hmm. And it takes a really particular kind of person or a particular skill set or a particular platform to do that well. And I think that this is where this journal and this book can really play a strong role. And policy analysts and policy teams in the government and policy teams in universities do this a lot. But I think creating a space where this is the goal is going to create a really amazing and really meaningful platform. And from my point of view, when I was sort of reflecting on what I wanted to talk about with this talk, I can see a lot of really meaningful ways that this journal, this book, this forum can be a way to kind of attack some of those big picture problems. So, for example, we've already heard some of our other panelists talk about how we can use this book as a way to talk about some of the emerging science that the scientific community has really deep knowledge on that the government might want to know about this. So in some ways, I can see it as a tool to provide early access and sort of almost like a foresight function to get access to this emerging science from the scientists themselves to actually support policy decisions, so on emerging technologies or emerging issues or emergency preparedness, things like that. But I also think it's a really cool forum to explore some like hardcore policy, like science policy discussions. So this is where I want to take my book chapter, which I'm really excited about. As a person who's worked on the sort of science side, the policy side, one of the challenges that I've been faced with constantly is the threat of mis and disinformation. And, working in a policy space and not necessarily having the same kind of scientific literacy for a lot of decision makers, that can be really challenging when you don't have the tools, you don't know the scientific world as well as like a hardcore scientist. I think this is a topic that I think that this journal can really get into. So not even just diving into a particular scientific topic, but getting into the nuances of how we use science. This is another way I think that this journal can be really useful. So that's what I'm going to get into, is looking at the threat of mis and disinformation. How is it propagated? What are the potential ways that misinformation is spread and some of the ways that it's threatening decision-making, democracy, trust, and then sort of point to some directions as to the role of science, society, and policy in combating mis and disinformation. So maybe I'll leave it at that. I'm obviously really excited about this. I've wanted this for a really long time. And I'm really excited to chat about how we can really build it up, how we can get good buy-in, and how we can make this something that is really useful.
Great. Excellent. Thank you, Kim. Thank all of you. We want to, there's lots of time left and we want to make this as interactive as possible. So we will open the floor up here in a minute for questions or comments from both the room and online. But just before we go there, I would like to maybe follow up, because you raised some of the challenges that are, it was great to hear.
Appetite a little bit.
And it's great to hear how, each of you are very supportive of what we're trying to do here. With obviously that, more of that, please. But it's fair to say that, there are barriers or there are challenges in terms of, bringing together these three spheres. So maybe I could go back to you, Peggy, first to talk a little bit about what do you see as those challenges or barriers that we should be keeping in mind as we move forward with this initiative?
Thank you for that question, Jeff. And as some of you know, I'm really interested in this question of the challenges, I guess, because my career has been so focused in these areas. And many years ago, I don't know if we ever talk about our work as being so much fun, but I really enjoyed preparing a blog once that a few years ago that I entitled Knowledge in a Blender, Why We're So Mixed Up About Evidence in Public Policy. And I tried there to identify, a number of different challenges that strike me as we think about this work. And as I was reviewing again the work around Confluences. So just very briefly, just because I enjoyed Kimberly's remarks and just to reflect on that a bit, I think we face a number of challenges around, first of all, the ongoing cynicism around these issues. And we hear expressions like policy-based evidence. And how do we address, these years of discussion around alternative facts, the post-truth era, comments about fake news, and then issues of misinformation, and how do we work against that sort of current? That's one challenge. The other one, though, that I often think about is the collision, between politics and science. And I'm not sure which, maybe it was Kimberly again, or maybe it was Danica who commented on, it was Kimberly, about, the positive support of the current government around science and evidence. And we know that isn't always the case. And I think some of us, we may recall that the 2013 study, going back a decade, by the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada, where 50% of federal public servants said that they, I think I've got the quote here, being aware of actual cases in which the health and safety of Canadians or environmental sustainability had been compromised because of political interference with the scientific work. And thinking about how do we address that or prepare for that, or when that we might see those sorts of things occurring. The other one that I'm very, very interested in is in regards to science and the so-called irreproducibility crisis. And the article that came out in Nature, I think it was back in 2016, where I think it was close to 70% of researchers said they couldn't replicate the work of their colleagues, and 50% indicated that they failed to reproduce their own. And then you might recall, like with the Nobel laureate, Frances Arnold, who I think described herself as, quote, totally bummed that she had to retract a scientific publication because the work was not reproducible. And so I just think of, challenges like that we face when people are skeptical or questioning the whole concept, the broader concept of science and evidence. But lastly, and this is what really attracts me or interests me as a policy wonk, is what we see happening in decision-making processes. And when I'm teaching graduate students in particular, I always remind them of a wonderful quote by the economist John Maynard Keynes, that there is nothing that the government hates more than to be well informed, for it makes the process of arriving at decisions much more complicated and difficult. And so we have to think not only about the content, not only about the knowledge and the information, but we have to think about policy processes and the way that decisions get made. And as we're creating this forum of confluences and creating this information for us to talk, we have to still think, okay, what are the processes? How do we work together? How do we actually have that impact around policy decision-making? Because it's not always that evidence is going to win the day or be the primary consideration. And lastly, and very specific to Confluences, is thinking about how do we get this work, this information into the hands of decision makers? There's a lot for them to read. There might only be one part of the volume that's of interest to them. And how do we make sure that the information, that they know that it's there? And it's a project about knowledge mobilization, and we have our homework to do with the knowledge mobilization itself. So those are just a number of the challenges I've been thinking about as we're talking about this work, but I love it, and that's why we're all coming together to discuss this. So thanks.
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that Peggy's remarks are like totally bang on. So I guess to follow up on that, some of the other sort of pieces that I have been thinking about in terms of challenges have been around, like getting the buy-in for sure. So how do we make sure that the right people are reading this? Because the reality is that, yes, we do have folks in the government who are going to be super stoked about this, but those are also probably likely the people who are already really engaged. And so I think that, from my point of view, this knowledge mobilization approach and like getting the word out is going to be a really important process. And so I was privileged to be in the room when we were planning this journal and talking about this. A lot of you were there too. But making sure that we're getting into the science policy teams, talking to individual departments, making the platform known. And I think it's going to be really important too that this journal doesn't add additional capacity for people, that it needs to be something that people can reach for, that they can read, that's going to be accessible, that's not something that they have to dig for. Because the last thing you want to do is add to this kind of like infodemic-y space where it's like, oh, there's just too much information all the time and you're just adding another thing to the pile that's not going to be useful. And so thinking about your comments, Peggy, one of the things that I love about policy, and one of the things that when I was at E4D and we were training scientists on how to engage with the government is I think that we also have to be aware of what the government's priorities are. And so, yeah, the government's priorities are going to change. And I think that that's one of the things that makes this particular publication really unique, that we can tailor it. It's a yearly publication. We've talked about potentially basing it on budget priorities or on government mandates, speech from the throne. I think that can actually make it a little bit like attractive to the government of the day. And I think that that's going to be important, because the goal isn't just to sort of preach to the public about stuff that you think is important for policy, but actually put things in it that's going to be meaningful to actual policy making. So making sure that it's really relevant, that it's actionable, that it actually is useful for the end receptor. I think that's going to be really important. One of the things that I've also been thinking about a lot as we've been planning this is how we prioritize topics, because I think that there's a risk. Obviously, folks like us who are a part of the science policy community are really excited to contribute and excited to have these discussions, but we don't want it to just be preaching to the choir and talking about issues that we all know about. We want it to be a useful forum to get science into the policymaking space. And I think in that way, it also needs to be driven sometimes a little bit from the top up or the top down in terms of the emerging issues that there's going to be policy decisions around. And we don't want it to be evidence for policy, but I do think that it needs to be useful. So that question for me around how we prioritize and how we identify topics for the journal is one that's been on my mind. And then I guess the last thing too is I think that there's also an opportunity not only to kind of sensitize the journal to the government decision-making space and the science space, but making sure that there's good public awareness as well. And so we talked a little bit about engaging media or getting the articles also out into things like, the CBC or the radio and places where the public can also engage with this, because it's not meant to just be policy wonky. It's also meant to be society. So yeah,
exactly.
Just some reflections.
And I mean, following those two comments, there's not much more to add, really. No, but I think I agree with Kim's point, certainly, that we need to make sure that what's being presented is relevant and useful and accessible and kind of thought of top of mind by the policymakers when they are looking for that evidence. And likewise that, and in order to do that, so yes, I think we need to prioritize. I think you have a group of very enthusiastic people here who could generate all sorts of things. So making sure that it's the right sort of things that lands in the policymakers' hands, so that they're using it appropriately. But I guess the only other piece that I would add on top of that is that it's not just what their priorities are and, looking, I think the budget's a great idea, looking to see where that could be, but understanding better the context within which they're working. Because oftentimes, you may see this priority and you may give the best advice based on what you know, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes in the kind of policy world that you may miss out on the context. You may not fully understand what they're looking for. And so the advice you give may not be useful to them in the end. Great.
It's all good advice. Thank you. So let's open things up and see if others either in the room or online have questions or comments. Bob.
Hi, folks. Bob Walker here, a member of the advisory committee and for a number of years now, a senior fellow with the Institute and a retired government science executive. I love it. I love it. And of course, being in the receiving mode, oftentimes in roles I've had for science-based evidence, I really see how difficult this is. I want to offer two thoughts to perhaps expand horizons a bit. Not necessarily where we start, but perhaps where we need to go. And we find ourselves in the science community often talking about science or science-based evidence for policy making, science-based evidence for policy makers, decision makers. And my sense is that we also want to consider the science of decision making.
That's a great point.
And I think implicit in a number of these questions around misinformation and the political versus science dynamic, we have this need to understand decision-making processes, and you use that term, and contextualizing it by the reality of the Canadian Constitution as well. The second point I'd offer is that while we use the term policymaking, I consider there's merit in just being a bit more explicit. And I think a better term, in my opinion, is actually decision-making by public authorities. politicians are only part of the equation. We have regulators, we have the courts, and that exists across 4 jurisdictions: federal, provincial, municipal, and indigenous. And when one talks about decisions that actually have enormous impact on the public, it's an interplay among the public authorities across all those spaces. So if you're trying to deliver science to inform that decision-making, you also need the science where you're understanding how that decision-making is working. And now, this may be, you're trying to tell public servants how their system works. It's complicated, and I'm not sure any of us understand how it works. And so investing in trying to understand the science of decision-making by public authorities, I think we open up the view in a constructive way. And I don't think I'm saying anything different than what folks have said. It's practiced a way with a bit of play of words to articulate this.
Responses or Peggy?
No, I agree.
Yeah.
No, I agree as well.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point, Bob. And it really strikes me as well that when I think of the way that we educate or train at our universities or post-secondary institutions, and what we can do to also help people understand, as you've said, what these policy processes or what the government environment is, or the public sector environment. It's just so important that we think about how we prepare next generations to work in those environments and to influence. I think you've made wonderful points.
I think that the timing of that is really good too. There's a lot of reflection happening after COVID about things like science advisory governance tables that got set up and reviews of, the processes of how we find and use evidence. And so I think that discussion about how we actually get science and evidence into decision-making is kind of ripe right now. And that's kind of what I was trying to get at in my remarks too, that I think that this particular journal can be a forum for both. Like, I actually think that we could publish something like that in this journal and it would be really well received. I mean, I'm saying this as a person who did a whole year study on how parliamentarians use evidence. So I'm kind of a nerd for this stuff, but I actually think that that's really important, not only to inform the content of the journal, but also that the journal could be a space to explore those types of topics too.
Absolutely. At Confluences, we welcome nerds. So. Others in the room, or if you're online, don't hesitate to put a question or comment in the chat, and Jen can pass that along. So, yeah.
I maybe will follow on from one of the parts that Bob said, and maybe it's my own biases. Like, I tend to think really federally because that's the context in which I operate. But a lot of these decisions are made at provincial, territorial, municipal, Indigenous governance levels. Has thought gone into how to keep it relevant to those folks as well? When Kim was talking about like budget and mandate letters and stuff, I was like, yes, exactly. And then I was like, oh wait, there's other people too. I know there's a tough balance between like targeting the people, making it useful to the people you want it to reach, and I guess determining the scope of those people.
So I just, as a response, I would say, in the spirit of, learn to crawl before you walk and walk before you run. We decided that, this is a pilot year. We're going to start with kind of the Ottawa focus. So primarily the federal government, but certainly the hope is that this becomes an annual initiative, and we can expand next year to other universities, other academics, but then also other levels of government, other decision-making authority.
Well, if we had like a little tab for each province. I'm getting too big for my. I'm just kidding. But
Fire up that shirt, Grant. Let's go.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say, as soon as we get that fundraising going, we'll do that. Jeremy, do you have any?
Nothing that I've really prepared, but one of the things that I feel obliged to constantly reflect on is the increasing and overt danger of misinformation. And Kim spoke, I think, very effectively on this topic and alluded to its importance. But I think I think almost no amount of attention to this issue is too much. It is the threat to democracy that we must grapple with, and if we fail to do it, we're going to lose something that we can't really do without. So I think one of the themes that I hope will emerge repeatedly in chapters in this initial installation of Confluences is the kind of ongoing tension between ideology and evidence. No one, I think, here is so simplistic as to think that evidence in a science context exclusively is responsible for decision-making, but it needs to be at the table. The challenge that I guess I perceive is the risk that ideology that is unmoored by reality will actually be the primary mover of decision-making in some sectors or in the future. And that's, I think, worth a loud and repeated set of warnings. And I think, frankly, Confluences must succeed at this, or it's going to have failed at everything that really matters. That everything else apart from this issue, from my point of view, is an interesting detail. But if we were to leave that out of our thinking in an explicit and careful way, the way that I think Kim was alluding to and others as well, then I think we would have missed the thing that was an absolutely overriding priority for the time being. Which is not to suggest that all the other issues that people want to talk about are unimportant. I just think that none of them will matter if we don't get that one right.
So no pressure. No, it's yeah, it's a valid point. In fact, when I was preparing the slide, I thought of listing as among the societal concerns, climate change, pandemics, inequality, Donald Trump, but the threats to democracy are very real. So Sarah or Daniela?
Speak quick if you would. I was just thinking from like a youth or graduate student perspective as well, there definitely would be room to engage with not only STEM students as well. Maybe there's room to engage with the policy community as they are also coming up into this world.
Yes.
And intersecting those veins of science into their education just as much as the policy is going into science education as well. So there might be definitely room there. I think there's a desire for youth to be more kind of interdisciplinary in this sense. So that might be a way to kind of bridge that gap. And being at UAuto, we have the tools to kind of make that kind of thing happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I know, Jeff, you and I talked about this like way back in the day, but I was thinking about this when I was prepping my remarks to you, because I think that this could be a really cool space for supporting trainees and learning how to speak that language. And I wonder, ISSP is an amazing faculty for this, about potentially even having like mentorship of like, partnering a grad student with a more experienced policy knowledgeable person who's knowledgeable of policy. Like could be a really cool way of like co-publishing an article, like maybe there's an article reserved at some point for a trainee. I don't know. Like I think that it's a cool thing that's been floating around in my brain about how to support scientists who might not have the tools to on their own contribute a piece in a way that feels policy relevant. I think that's
scary, right? To step yourself out into a different field that you have no experience in. So that might be a good opportunity to.
I mean, we have SPE on the advisory board, which is amazing, and the Ottawa Science Policy Network can support our science. And so I feel like we have the right folks at the table to explore that topic.
Yeah.
Mind.
Daniela, do you want to jump in?
Well, just to maybe just reiterate what others have said and to let you know that us at with the Imagining Canada's Future initiative at SSHRC are having very similar conversations and discussions. I don't know how familiar you are with the knowledge synthesis grants that we have. We had got 16 challenges. I know some are more familiar than others around the table. As we start thinking and looking forward to the next X number of years, these are kind of really critical conversations that we need to have as well as we consider what the priority areas are. And of course, one of our challenges is truth in a post-fact world. And I see we've also been discussing within the team that is one that continues to be relevant. That is one we'd like to do actually more on. So just to say that these thoughts, these questions are at the forefront of what we're considering as well. And the knowledge mobilization piece in particular is going to be really critical to that. So we look forward to kind of seeing how you deal with it and learning from you as we also, adapt our approach and kind of hone in on what we want to focus on and what the best modality, the ideal modality would be to do that with our programs and grants and all that. So it's very relevant and very timely with the Future Challenges Division. So
yes, good.
Yeah.
I think we all agree it's a very timely initiative and there's a lot of potential for it. And so now it's up to all of us to help deliver. We're not out of time. So with that, let me turn to Jen for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Jeff. So just to start the closing, I want to start by thanking our panelists. So Peggy, Danica, Kim, thank you for joining us today and for helping us put on a really great discussion. This project also wouldn't be possible without all of you around the table, our advisory group, as well as our authors. We thank you for your contributions, and I think we're really excited to see how this comes together. So thank you for your commitment. And last but not least, thank you to everyone who joined us online and for your interest in this project. I did share a link to the Confluences project page on our website if you're interested in learning more. And I also shared a link to connect with the ISSP. So follow us on social media, Facebook, not Facebook, LinkedIn and Twitter or X, as well as our newsletter. We just recently revamped it, refocused it so that we're presenting really fresh and engaging content. So make sure to sign up to learn about everything we're putting on, including our next event, which will be on November 1st. So more to come soon.
Thank you, everyone.